July 5, 2003, Carterfold, Virginia. The man in black shuffled onto a stage he could barely see. His hands trembled, his voice cracked, and in that moment, every single person in that small mountain venue knew they were witnessing something they would never forget, something sacred and utterly devastating. Johnny Cash was dying, and he was going to sing anyway. What happened in the next 37 minutes would shatter the myth of the invincible outlaw and reveal a truth so raw, so unbearably human, that even his closest friends couldn't watch without weeping. This wasn't a concert. This was a goodbye no one was ready to hear. Before we dive into the heartbreak, tell me, what city are you watching from right now? Drop it in the comments because this story connects us all through the universal language of loss and love. Here's the question that'll haunt you. If you knew you had one final chance to do what you loved most, would you have the courage to face it knowing your body was betraying you? Johnny Cash did. And if this story moves you the way it should, hit that subscribe button, because we're about to explore the most vulnerable moment in country music history, and you need to be here for every second of it. The stage lights at Carterfold were dimmer than usual that evening, but it wasn't an artistic choice. Johnny Cash's eyes couldn't handle brightness anymore. His autonomic neuropathy, a cruel consequence of diabetes that had ravaged his body for years, had deteriorated to the point where even basic functions felt like climbing mountains. Standing required concentration. Walking demanded assistance. Singing, that was supposed to be impossible. Yet there he stood, 71 years old, barely 90 days after burying the love of his life, June Carter Cash, refusing to let the final chapter write itself. The crowd of 200 people sat in absolute silence as he gripped the microphone stand like it was the only thing tethering him to earth. His son, John Carter Cash, stood just off stage, watching his father with a mixture of pride and terror that only a child witnessing a parent's final act of defiance could understand. John had begged him not to do this. The doctors had forbidden it. Common sense screamed against it. But Johnny Cash had never been a man who listened to reason when his soul had something to say. And his soul? It was screaming now, desperate to honor June one last time, desperate to prove that even in death's shadow, music could still mean something. The first notes of Ring of Fire, June's song, their song, trembled through the air like a prayer. But something was wrong. Everyone could hear it, feel it hanging in the humid Virginia air like a storm that refused to break. His voice, once a thunderous baritone that could shake stadiums and silence rowdy crowds with a single word, now wavered with fragility. It cracked on the high notes. It disappeared entirely on certain syllables. Yet somehow, impossibly, it carried more emotional weight than any performance in his 5-decade career. This wasn't the Johnny Cash of Folsom Prison or San Quentin. This wasn't the rebel who shot a man in Reno just to watch him die. This was a man stripped of everything except the most fundamental truth. He was mortal, he was broken, and he was singing anyway. The audience didn't applaud. They couldn't. Some covered their mouths, others let tears fall freely. They were witnessing something that transcended entertainment. What they didn't know, what nobody in that venue could have possibly understood in that moment, was that Johnny had made a promise to June in her final hours, a promise so sacred that breaking it would have meant abandoning everything their 40-year love story represented. June Carter Cash had died on May 15, 2003, following complications from heart surgery. Johnny had been there, holding her hand, whispering songs into her ear as her heartbeat slowed and finally stopped. In those last moments, as morphine dulled her pain but not her awareness, she had looked at him with those eyes that had first captured his attention backstage at the Grand Ole Opry in 1956, and she had said something that would haunt him every day for the rest of his life. "Promise me you'll keep singing, John. Promise me you won't stop being who you are just because I'm not there to see it." He had promised. And now, barely holding himself upright, he was keeping that promise even as his body screamed for him to stop. The second song was Big River, and his guitar player had to help position the instrument across his lap since standing with it was no longer possible. Johnny's fingers, once capable of lightning-fast chord progressions and intricate picking patterns, moved slowly, methodically, like an old man remembering muscle memory from a lifetime ago, which is exactly what he was. The irony wasn't lost on anyone watching. Here was a man who had outlived almost everyone from his generation of country legends, who had survived addiction and betrayal and near-death experiences too numerous to count, now struggling to complete a 3-minute song. But he persevered, note by painful note, because stopping would mean admitting defeat. And Johnny Cash had never admitted defeat in his entire life, so why would he start now when it mattered most? Between songs, he spoke to the audience in a voice barely above a whisper, sharing memories of June that made the vulnerability even more acute. He talked about how she used to stand in the wings during his performances, mouthing the words along with him, her presence giving him strength even when addiction had stolen everything else. He described the way she laughed, a sound he would never hear again, and how that laugh had saved him more times than he could count. These weren't rehearsed anecdotes or polished stage banter. This was a man processing grief in real time, using the only language he truly spoke, music and truth. The audience became unwitting participants in his mourning process, witnesses to something so intimate it felt almost inappropriate to watch. But they couldn't look away. Nobody could look away. The third song was I Walk the Line, and halfway through the first verse, something happened that would become the defining image of that night, the moment that every person in attendance would carry with them for the rest of their lives. Johnny Cash stopped singing mid-phrase, closed his eyes, and a single tear rolled down his weathered cheek. For 10 seconds that felt like 10 years, there was only silence. The band held their notes, the audience held their breath, and Johnny held on to consciousness by sheer force of will. When he opened his eyes again and continued singing, his voice had changed. It was smaller now, more fragile, but somehow more powerful because of it. He wasn't performing anymore. He was confessing. What was he confessing? That would become clear as the concert progressed, as each song stripped away another layer of the mythology surrounding the man in black. John Carter Cash would later describe watching his father that night as witnessing someone transform suffering into art in its purest form. The technical execution was objectively poor, missed notes, forgotten lyrics, timing issues that would have been unacceptable in any other context. But the emotional execution? That was flawless. That was transcendent. Because Johnny wasn't trying to prove he could still be a star. He was trying to prove he could still be human. And in a culture that worships perfection and fears vulnerability, that act of courageous imperfection felt revolutionary. The audience understood this on some primal level, which is why the atmosphere in that small venue shifted from concert to ceremony. By the fourth song, Hurt, the 9 Inch Nails cover that had become his unexpected swan song, everyone knew they were participating in something unrepeatable. The choice to perform Hurt was deliberate and devastating in equal measure. Johnny had recorded the song just months earlier for his American Ivory album, and the music video, featuring footage of him looking frail and haunted in his Tennessee home, had already become a cultural touchstone for understanding mortality through art. But hearing him perform it live, in this condition, with June's absence hanging over everything like fog, that was different. That was witnessing a man willingly walk into his own eulogy and deliver it with brutal honesty. I hurt myself today, to see if I still feel, took on entirely new meaning when sung by someone whose body had become a prison, whose every movement registered as pain. The audience shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't entertainment anymore. It was exposure therapy for everyone's deepest fear about aging and loss. His voice cracked on, "Everyone I know goes away in the end," and for a moment it seemed like he might not be able to continue. His breathing had become labored. Sweat covered his face despite the evening coolness. The stage crew exchanged worried glances, ready to intervene if necessary. But Johnny pushed through because pushing through was the only thing he knew how to do. He had pushed through poverty in Arkansas. He had pushed through addiction that should have killed him a dozen times. He had pushed through the deaths of friends, the collapse of his first marriage, the judgment of the music industry when they wrote him off as a has-been. This was just one more thing to push through, except this time there would be no recovery waiting on the other side. This time, pushing through meant accepting the end while refusing to surrender dignity. Between Hurt and the next song, Johnny spoke directly about June for the first time that evening, with complete vulnerability. "She was here with me for 40 years, he said, his voice barely carrying to the back row. 40 years of her fixing everything I broke, including myself, and now I'm supposed to figure out how to exist without her, and I don't think I can do that." The confession hung in the air like a physical weight. Someone in the third row audibly sobbed. This wasn't what people came to concerts for. They came for escape, for joy, for the illusion that legends never falter. But Johnny was offering something different, the truth that legends are just people, and people break just like everyone else. What made it even more heartbreaking was the knowledge that he was right. He couldn't do it. Johnny Cash would die exactly 4 months later, on September 12, 2003. The official cause would be listed as complications from diabetes, but everyone who knew him understood the real cause, a broken heart. Medical science can dismiss the idea of dying from heartbreak as romantic fiction, but June's death had destroyed something fundamental in Johnny that no medication could repair. His will to fight, the thing that had sustained him through decades of chaos, evaporated the moment she took her last breath. This concert was him honoring her memory while simultaneously acknowledging that his own story was ending. The audience sensed this, which transformed the evening from performance into vigil. They weren't watching Johnny Cash the legend. They were keeping watch over Johnny Cash the dying man, offering silent support as he completed his final mission. The sixth song was "Sunday Morning Coming Down," Chris Christopherson's meditation on loneliness that Johnny had made famous decades earlier. But now every lyric about waking up alone and wishing yesterday would leave him alone carried prophetic weight. This wasn't a character study anymore. This was autobiography. The line, "There's nothing short of dying that's half as lonesome as the sound of sleeping city sidewalks," became almost unbearable when delivered by someone actively experiencing that exact loneliness, that exact confrontation with mortality. His phrasing had slowed to a crawl, each word carefully enunciated as if he was savoring language one final time. And perhaps he was. Perhaps he knew, even then, that his days of using words and melody to make sense of the world were numbered in weeks, not years. John Carter Cash made a decision in that moment that he would question for the rest of his life. He didn't stop the concert. His father was clearly suffering, clearly pushing himself beyond what was healthy or safe, and John had the authority to end it. One word to the stage manager, and they could have helped Johnny off stage with dignity and tact. But John also understood something crucial. Stopping the concert would have destroyed his father more completely than physical pain ever could. This was Johnny's last act of agency, his final opportunity to define himself on his own terms rather than being defined by illness. Taking that away would have been a cruelty disguised as mercy. So John stood there, watching and hoping and praying that his father's will was stronger than his failing body. For 37 minutes it was. But what happened next would test that will beyond anything anyone could have anticipated. The seventh song should have been "Folsom Prison Blues," the anthem that had defined early Johnny Cash and remained his most requested number for 40 years. Everyone expected it. The band had it prepared, but when Johnny opened his mouth to sing the iconic opening line, "I hear the train a-comin', it's rolling round the bend," nothing came out. Not a whisper, not a croak, nothing. His vocal cords, stretched beyond capacity by 6 straight songs in his condition, had simply stopped functioning. The silence that followed was excruciating. 200 people collectively held their breath, waiting to see what would happen when an unstoppable force met an immovable object, when Johnny Cash's will encountered absolute physical limitation. For 15 seconds he sat there in silence, gripping the microphone, his face showing not frustration but something closer to resignation, the look of a man finally accepting what he had been denying for months. Then he did something that made the entire heartbreaking evening worth it, something that revealed the truth this concert had been building toward all along. He started laughing. Not bitterly, not with irony, but with genuine amusement at the absurdity of it all. Here he was, the man in black, the voice of the American outlaw, defeated not by demons or drugs or the music industry, but by basic biology. The laugh started small, just a chuckle really, but it grew until his shoulders shook and tears ran down his face, though whether they were from laughter or grief nobody could say. The audience didn't know how to react. Was this a breakdown? A breakthrough? Both? It was the moment Johnny Cash stopped trying to be Johnny Cash the icon and simply became John, a 71-year-old widower saying goodbye. He spoke into the microphone, his speaking voice somehow still functional, even though his singing voice had abandoned him. "Well," he said, with that crooked smile that had charmed millions, "I reckon that's about all I've got left in me tonight. June always said I never knew when to quit, but I think she'd forgive me for quitting right now." The audience erupted, not in applause but in something deeper, a sound of collective release that acknowledged what everyone had witnessed. They had come expecting a concert and received a masterclass in human vulnerability instead. Johnny waved weakly, allowed his son to help him stand, and shuffled off stage to a standing ovation that lasted 7 minutes. 7 minutes of 200 people refusing to stop clapping, refusing to let him disappear into the night without knowing how much this had mattered. But the story doesn't end there, because what happened after that concert reveals the most heartbreaking truth of all. The truth that nobody, including Johnny himself, was ready to confront. In the car ride back to his home in Hendersonville, Tennessee, Johnny turned to his son and said something that John would later describe as the saddest thing I ever heard my father say. He said, "I kept my promise to her. She asked me to keep singing, and I did. But I don't think I can keep that promise anymore, son. I think that was the last time." John tried to argue, tried to suggest that with rest and treatment, there could be more performances, more moments. But Johnny just shook his head and stared out the window at the passing darkness. He knew what his body had been telling him all night. The tank was empty, the reserves exhausted, the final chapter closing whether he wanted it to or not. Medical records would later show that Johnny's health deteriorated rapidly after that concert, as if the act of performing one last time had consumed whatever life force he had been hoarding. He was hospitalized multiple times in August for respiratory issues. His diabetes management became increasingly complicated. But more than the physical decline, those who visited him in those final weeks noted a spiritual exhaustion, a man who had completed his life's work and saw no point in continuing the charade of recovery. He had honored June's memory. He had shown the world that vulnerability and strength weren't opposites. He had transformed suffering into art one final time. What else was there? In quiet moments, he would listen to recordings of June's voice, and friends reported that he would sometimes talk to her as if she was still in the room. "I'll be there soon," he would say. "I kept my promise. Now I'm coming home." The footage from that final concert, grainy, shot on amateur cameras by audience members, has become sacred text for understanding the intersection of art and mortality. Music scholars study it. Grief counselors reference it. But beyond the academic analysis, it serves a simpler purpose. It reminds us that authenticity matters more than perfection, that showing up matters even when you can barely stand, that love can compel us to do impossible things. Johnny Cash didn't need to perform that night. He could have stayed home, preserved his dignity, let his legend remain untarnished by the reality of decline. But he chose exposure over protection, truth over mythology. And in doing so, he gave everyone in that audience, and everyone who would later hear about that night, permission to be imperfect, to struggle, to fall apart while still moving forward. That's the truth nobody was ready for, that our heroes are human, and their humanity is what makes them heroic in the first place. The aftermath of the Carter Fold concert rippled through the country music community like shockwaves from an earthquake nobody saw coming. Within days, bootleg recordings circulated among musicians and industry insiders, and the response was unanimous devastation. Chris Christopherson, upon hearing about Johnny's voiceless moment during Folsom Prison Blues, broke down crying during a radio interview. "That man has given everything," Christopherson said, his voice breaking. "Everything, and he's still trying to give more." Emmylou Harris, who had considered Johnny a mentor and friend for decades, released a statement calling the concert The bravest thing I've ever witnessed in this business. Even younger artists who had never met Johnny personally felt the weight of what had happened. Here was living proof that talent doesn't protect you from time, that legacy doesn't shield you from loss. The message was clear and terrifying. This happens to everyone eventually, even the invincible ones. But perhaps the most telling response came from those who had been in the audience that night. In interviews conducted years later, attendees described the concert with language typically reserved for religious experiences or life-altering tragedies. One woman said, "I went in thinking I was going to see Johnny Cash perform. I left having witnessed a man die on stage in the most beautiful, terrible way possible." A man who had brought his teenage son to the show as a birthday present said, "I wanted my boy to see a legend. Instead, we both learned what it means to face the end with dignity." These weren't casual observations. They were testimonies from people whose understanding of mortality had been fundamentally altered by 37 minutes in a small Virginia venue. They had expected entertainment and received education in what it means to be fully, painfully human. The recording industry's response was more complicated, revealing the uncomfortable tension between commerce and compassion that defines modern music. Johnny's label, American Recordings, initially considered releasing audio from the concert, but ultimately decided against it, not because of quality concerns, but because Rick Rubin, the producer who had revitalized Johnny's late career, felt it would be exploitative to profit from someone's suffering. This decision sparked debate among fans and critics. Some argued that documenting that final performance was an act of historical preservation, that future generations deserved to hear authenticity in its rawest form. Others insisted that some moments are too sacred for commodification, that Johnny's vulnerability that night belonged to him and the 200 witnesses, not to the marketplace. The truth, as usual, existed somewhere in the messy middle between these positions, but the debate itself revealed how deeply the concert had disturbed the comfortable narratives we tell ourselves about aging artists. Meanwhile, in Hendersonville, Johnny Cash spent his final weeks doing something unexpected. He returned to the studio. Despite barely being able to stand, despite his voice being a fraction of what it once was, he worked with Rick Rubin on what would become his final recordings. These sessions, captured for the posthumous album American v. 100 Highways, show a man racing against time, desperate to leave one more statement, one more piece of evidence that he existed and felt and mattered. He covered songs by 9 Inch Nails and Gordon Lightfoot. He revisited his own classics with new arrangements that acknowledged his limitations. And in the spaces between takes, he talked about June constantly, asking if she would have liked a particular vocal approach, wondering if she was listening from wherever she had gone. These weren't the questions of a man in denial. They were the questions of someone trying to maintain connection across the barrier of death, using music as a bridge between worlds. The recordings are difficult to listen to, not because they're bad, but because they're so obviously goodbye letters. Every song choice, every strained note, every pause for breath tells the same story. I'm leaving soon, and here's what I wanted to say before I go. Like the 309, a song about a train heading to heaven becomes almost unwatchable when you know Johnny would be on that train within weeks. His cover of Gordon Lightfoot's If You Could Read My Mind transforms into a direct address to June. The lyrics about broken relationships taking on new meaning when sung by a man whose relationship had been severed by death rather than choice. The rawness makes modern pop music, with its auto-tune smoothness and algorithmic perfection, seem almost offensive by comparison. This was what music could be when stripped of all pretense, pure emotional communication at the cost of technical precision. But here's what haunts everyone who has studied this period. Johnny knew exactly what he was doing. In conversations with Rick Rubin during those final sessions, he explicitly framed the work as getting my affairs in order. He chose songs about death, about longing, about being ready to go. He refused to record anything that suggested hope for recovery or plans for the future. This wasn't unconscious. This was a man curating his own exit, controlling the narrative one last time before the story ended without his input. In that sense, the Carterfold concert and these final recordings were two parts of the same project. Documenting the end with unflinching honesty, refusing to let death be something that happened to him passively. If Johnny Cash was going to die, He was going to do it on his terms, with his voice, however diminished, telling the truth about what that process actually felt like. September 12, 2003, arrived with the inevitability of a train pulling into its final station. Johnny Cash died at 2 a.m. in Baptist Hospital in Nashville, Tennessee, with his family surrounding him, just as June had been surrounded months earlier. The cause was complications from diabetes, but the real cause, the thing that actually killed him, was abundantly clear to everyone who had watched his decline. He had died from June's absence, from the accumulated weight of 71 years of living hard and feeling everything, from the simple fact that his body could no longer support the massive soul it had carried for so long. The news broke at dawn, and the response was global. Radio stations played his music non-stop. Strangers wept publicly. The Country Music Hall of Fame hastily organized a memorial display, but for those 200 people who had been at Carter Fold 9 weeks earlier, the news felt different. They had already mourned him, had already said goodbye during that concert that was really a wake. The funeral was held at First Baptist Church in Hendersonville, a building Johnny and June had attended together for decades. The service was exactly what you would expect for a legend of his stature, packed with famous mourners, media coverage, lengthy tributes from musicians and politicians. But those who were there say the most powerful moment came not from the scheduled eulogies, but from an unexpected source. June and Johnny's grandson had brought a portable speaker and played a recording from the Carter Fold concert, specifically the moment when Johnny's voice had failed during Folsom Prison Blues, followed by his laugh of surrender. The church fell completely silent as the recording played, as everyone confronted the same reality. The Johnny Cash they had loved was both the titan who walked the line and the fragile man who couldn't sing his own songs. Both versions were true, and the tension between them was what made him matter. Chris Christopherson, delivering the main eulogy, said something that perfectly captured the significance of that final concert. Johnny didn't just sing about prisoners and outlaws and broken people because it made good songs. He sang about them because he was them, and at the end, when his body was a prison and he was broken in every way a person can be broken, he showed us what it actually means to walk the line between giving up and pushing forward. Most of us will never be tested like that, but if we are, we have his example. The congregation erupted in applause, but it was applause mixed with sobbing, the sound of a community trying to celebrate while actively grieving. They were mourning not just Johnny, but the loss of an era when artists could be complicated and contradictory and still beloved. In death, Johnny Cash became a symbol for authenticity in an increasingly synthetic world, which is ironic for someone who spent so much of his life struggling with addiction and darkness. The burial took place immediately after the service at Hendersonville Memory Gardens, where June had been buried 4 months earlier. The plot selection wasn't accidental. Johnny had chosen it himself within days of June's death, knowing he would be joining her soon. The headstone, which wouldn't be placed until weeks later, would eventually read simply, John R. Cash, 1932-2003, next to June Carter Cash, 1929-2003. No elaborate epitaphs, no list of accomplishments, just names and dates, as if to say that in the end, the only thing that mattered was that these two people existed and loved each other. As the casket was lowered into the ground, someone in the crowd started singing, Will the Circle Be Unbroken? And within seconds, hundreds of voices joined in, a spontaneous tribute that Johnny would have appreciated far more than any carefully orchestrated ceremony. For a moment, the line between performer and audience dissolved completely, and everyone was just people singing together about loss and hope and the possibility of reunion beyond death. But the question that lingered after the funeral, the question that continues to haunt everyone who has studied Johnny Cash's final months, is this. Was the Carter Fold concert an act of heroic defiance or cruel self-destruction? Should his family have intervened, protected him from himself, preserved his dignity by preventing that public deterioration? Or was allowing him that final performance the greatest gift they could have given, the chance to end his story as a musician rather than as a patient? Medical ethicists have used this case in discussions about patient autonomy and quality of life. Music historians debate whether documenting decline serves art or exploits suffering, and fans argue passionately on both sides. unable to agree on whether watching Johnny struggle through those songs was beautiful or uncomfortable or both. The answer probably is that it was both, that real human moments resist clean categorization, existing instead in the complicated space between triumph and tragedy. In the 20 years since Johnny Cash's death, the Carter Fold concert has taken on mythological status. Young musicians study it to understand the relationship between technical ability and emotional truth. Fans make pilgrimages to the venue, which has preserved the stage exactly as it was that night. Scholars included in discussions about performance art and mortality. But perhaps most significantly, it has become a touchstone for anyone struggling with the question of when to quit, whether quitting means retiring from a career, ending a relationship, or stopping medical treatment. Johnny's decision to perform, despite knowing he probably shouldn't, has given permission to countless people to make their own final stands, to insist on agency, even when their bodies are failing. The message isn't never give up in some toxic positivity sense. The message is, you get to decide what your last act means, and nobody can take that from you. What nobody talks about enough is how the concert changed the definition of what a good performance could be. For decades, the music industry had operated on the assumption that technical proficiency was the baseline. You had to hit the notes, keep the rhythm, deliver consistency. But Johnny's final performance shattered that assumption by being objectively terrible from a technical standpoint, while simultaneously being the most emotionally powerful concert anyone in attendance had ever experienced. This paradox forced a reckoning. If bad singing can move people more than perfect singing, what exactly are we measuring when we judge art? The question extends far beyond music into every creative field. How many writers have abandoned projects because they couldn't achieve some imaginary standard of perfection? How many painters have destroyed canvases that didn't match their vision? Johnny Cash's gift that night was showing that sometimes the imperfect thing, the broken thing, the thing that barely functions, sometimes that's the truest expression of human experience. The physical toll of the concert manifested almost immediately. Friends who visited Johnny in the days after report that he seemed diminished in ways that went beyond mere exhaustion. It was as if performing had consumed some essential spark, leaving behind only the mechanical processes of existence. He slept most of the time. He ate rarely. Conversations became one-sided, with visitors speaking and Johnny occasionally nodding or offering single-word responses. But periodically, when June's name came up, he would become animated for brief moments, telling stories about their early days together or sharing private jokes that nobody else understood. These flashes of engagement became increasingly rare as September approached, like a candle flickering before going out. His body was shutting down, but his mind, or at least the part of his mind dedicated to June, remained active until almost the very end. The medical team treating Johnny in those final weeks faced an ethical dilemma that has since become a case study in palliative care. How aggressive should treatment be for someone who clearly doesn't want to recover? Johnny refused most interventions. He declined additional surgeries. He stopped taking medications that might extend his life but would also extend his suffering. His explicit position, stated clearly to his doctors, was that he had lived long enough and wanted to die on his own terms, rather than through prolonged medical intervention. But his children, understandably, struggled with this decision. They wanted every possible day with their father, even if those days involved suffering. The compromise reached, basic comfort care without life-extending measures, satisfied nobody but respected Johnny's autonomy. It was exactly the kind of complicated, no-good-answer situation that defines end-of-life care, where love and logic pull in opposite directions and there's no clear right choice. In his very last conscious conversation, held 2 days before his death, Johnny spoke about the concert one final time. John Carter Cash, sitting beside his father's hospital bed, asked if he regretted performing that night, given how it had accelerated his decline. Johnny took almost a full minute to answer, his breathing labored, his words slow and careful. "It was the last true thing I did," he said. "Everything after was just waiting. But that night I was still me, still John, still a singer, still her husband keeping a promise." He paused, then added something that made John start crying. "I hope the people there understood what I was trying to say. I hoped they knew I wasn't just singing songs. I was showing them it's okay to be scared and broken and to do the thing anyway. That was Johnny Cash's final statement on the purpose of art and the responsibility of artists. To tell the truth even when the truth is uncomfortable, to be vulnerable even when vulnerability feels like weakness. The global response to his death revealed just how deeply his authenticity had resonated across cultures and generations. From prison inmates who had felt seen by his Folsom and San Quentin concerts, to recovering addicts who found hope in his stories of redemption, to elderly couples who played Ring of Fire at their weddings, everyone had a Johnny Cash story, a moment when his music had intersected with their lives in meaningful ways. But the most touching tributes came from ordinary people who had never considered themselves particularly musical or artistic. They talked about how Johnny had given them permission to fail publicly, to struggle visibly, to be human in a culture that demands perfection. A truck driver in Montana said, "When I heard about that last concert, about how his voice gave out but he kept going, it made me feel like maybe it's okay that I'm not who I used to be. Maybe getting older and slower doesn't mean I'm worthless." That sentiment, repeated in thousands of variations across the world, revealed the deepest truth about Johnny Cash's legacy. He had normalized human imperfection at a time when society was increasingly intolerant of anything less than perfect. 20 years later, the Carter Fold venue still receives weekly letters from people who weren't even born when Johnny Cash died, asking about that final concert, wanting to understand how someone could turn their own deterioration into art. The venue has considered doing a formal audio release of the concert, but June and Johnny's estate has consistently declined, maintaining that some moments should remain lived experiences rather than commodified products. This decision frustrates researchers and fans who believe that history should be preserved and accessible. But it also honors Johnny's lifelong suspicion of the music industry's tendency to package and sell everything, including pain. The fact that you can't stream or download that concert, that you have to rely on witness testimony and bootleg fragments, actually makes it more powerful. It remains unfinished, unpolished, uncommodified, exactly like the life it documented. The ultimate heartbreaking truth that Johnny Cash revealed that night, the truth nobody was ready for, wasn't about death or loss or aging, though it included all those things. The truth was simpler and more terrifying. You will eventually reach a point where your body can't do what your soul demands, and in that moment, you have to choose between protecting your dignity or honoring your purpose. Most people choose dignity, which is understandable and valid, but Johnny chose purpose. He chose to show up broken and struggle publicly rather than preserve the myth of the invincible man in black. And in making that choice, he transformed his final concert from a performance into a kind of sacred text about what it means to be human. Not superhuman, not legendary, just human with all the fragility and courage that implies.